My name is Sarah Rodriguez, Captain, United States Air Force. 3 months ago, I woke up in a military hospital with a dislocated shoulder and a face swollen from impact. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the searing image burned into my mind. My mother, standing frozen in the doorway of my own bedroom, her eyes empty as she watched my superior, Marcus, squeeze the life out of me. Before I lost consciousness, I had managed to activate the emergency beacon that saved my life. Before I tell you how my pilot family responded to that SOS signal, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the sky should be a place of freedom, not a prison. But it didn't start that way. Long before those airborne missions, my first heaven was lost in a quiet suburb of Dallas, Texas. My childhood was a sun-soaked Texas dream, a perfect bubble that I never imagined could shatter. We lived in a modest ranch-style house in North Dallas, where the air always smelled of bluebonnet grass and the vibrant peonies that climbed our fence. My father, a Navy pilot at Naval Air Station, was a man of quiet precision. The same hands that could read complex flight maps with meticulous detail were the patient hands that taught me how to read the instruments in my first cockpit simulator. The smell of aviation gas is forever linked to my memories of him. His soul belonged to the sky. Every weekend he would take me up in his old Ford F-150 to the base. The dashboard cracked from a lifetime under the Texas sun, and the radio only picked up country stations. But that truck was the chariot that carried me to heaven. We would drive to the aircraft viewing area where he taught me to identify planes, to feel the sound of jet engines overhead. "The sky can be scary, sweetheart," he would always say, his hand on my shoulder as we watched the F-18s take off. "But you never be afraid. You face every cloud head-on." My mother was a high school librarian who saw poetry in everything. While we were at the base, she would sit on the bleachers, absorbed in a thick paperback novel, a serene smile on her face. She was our anchor, the peaceful center of our perfect universe. I was safe. I was loved. I thought that life, that feeling would last forever. But perfection is as fragile as glass. It shattered on a gray, drizzling Tuesday afternoon. My father was conducting a routine training flight when his F-18 engine malfunctioned. He died instantly in the crash. I remember 2 Navy officers standing on our porch, rain dripping from the brims of their caps. Their faces solemn, their voices practiced and emotionless as they spoke the words that vaporized our world. My mother didn't just fall. She collapsed. Her body folded inward as a tearing sound came from her throat. A raw, primal scream of disbelief so deep it still echoes in the darkest corners of my mind. The months that followed were a colorless fog. Our house, once filled with Dad's coffee aroma and Mom's baking, now reeked of sympathy lilies and countless casseroles that well-meaning neighbors left behind. My mother quit her librarian job. Her world shrank to the 4 walls of her bedroom, curtains perpetually drawn. Most days, she didn't even get out of bed. At 12, I became a ghost in my own childhood home. I made peanut butter sandwiches for dinner by the kitchen sink. I learned to use the washing machine by reading the faded instruction manual. I learned to tiptoe, afraid to disturb the suffocating silence. Financial stress moved like a slow poison. The life insurance money wasn't enough. Red-stamped overdue notices began appearing in the mail. My mother, on the rare days she emerged from her room, moved with devastating slowness, selling piece by piece of our life. First her jewelry, then my father's model airplane collection, just to keep the lights on. I watched her, a stranger in my mother's body, and felt a painful, helpless desperation. 2 years after the accident, when I was 14, Marcus Thompson stepped into our lives. He was a pilot officer that a family friend introduced to help me with my aviation dreams. He was a big man, filling the doorframe with broad shoulders, radiating an energy that our house hadn't felt in years. He had a confident smile and flight-gloved hands that helped my mother sort through tangled insurance papers, then fixed an old computer, then the broken gate, refusing to take a dime for the extra work. He brought life back with him, the sound of his car engine, the scent of military cologne, the rumble of the Mustang in our driveway all were proof that the world was still turning. He started bringing groceries and telling my mother stories about flights until she laughed. A real, genuine laugh that startled me. He took her out to dinner. He helped her organize debts, working through the mountain of paperwork that had overwhelmed her. He looked at her one evening and said, "A beautiful woman like you shouldn't have to carry everything alone." And I saw the light return to my mother's eyes. He was like our savior. The day they announced their engagement, Marcus gave me a gift. It was a small velvet-lined box. Inside was an elaborate pair of silver pilot's wings. As he pinned it to my shirt, he leaned so close I could feel his warm breath on my ear. His voice was a low whisper, threatening and meant only for me. "Your dad is dead," he murmured. "From now on, I take care of your mom and you as long as you know your place." A cold fear washed over me, a primal terror that had nothing to do with the cold metal on my shirt. This wasn't a promise. This was a threat. A few steps away, my mother watched, her eyes filled with happy tears, seeing only a man she loved giving a gift to her daughter. She beamed, completely unaware that he had just fastened the first collar around my neck. The night after the wedding was the beginning of the end. I was in my room, my sanctuary with Dad's old headphones, trying to find comfort in familiar country songs. The door suddenly burst open with a violent bang. Marcus stood there, his large frame silhouetted against the hallway light, his face a mask of rage. He stepped in and yanked the headphones from my head. They clattered to the floor. "In this house, we don't live like separate individuals," he growled, his voice like a low rumble. "We are a family. Doors stay open unless you're sleeping. Do you understand?" My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked past him, my eyes desperately seeking my mother, who was hovering in the hallway. "Help me, say something, please." But she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the worn carpet patch by my door, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. Her silence was his victory. Her silence was my surrender. In that moment, watching her choose fear over me, I knew the rules had changed. My home was no longer my home. It was his. The years after Marcus arrived were a slow, suffocating descent. He never laid a hand on me. Not then. He didn't need to. The prison he built wasn't made of iron bars. It was constructed from fear, shame, and my mother's silent compliance. My bedroom door stayed perpetually ajar, a constant reminder that I had no privacy, no sanctuary. The house became quiet, the air thick with unspoken rules and the tension of my mother's fear. Life became a performance. On Sundays, Marcus would turn on NASCAR, invite the neighbors over. He would sit there, beer in one hand, remote in the other, the perfect picture of an all-American family man. I remember him wrapping his arm around my mother's shoulders and telling the neighbors, "I'm a lucky man to have her. She'd be nothing without me." Everyone laughed, thinking it was a joke, but I saw the flash of pain in my mother's eyes. We both knew it was a declaration of ownership. When I was 17, a small ray of light appeared. I won the state literature prize for an essay about my father and the dream of flying. My English teacher, MS Williams, hugged me, told me I had real talent. I clutched the certificate, the crisp paper feeling like a passport to another life, and ran home, desperate to share the good news with my mother. I found her in the kitchen with Marcus, who was sitting at the table sipping a beer. "Mom, look at this," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. She turned around, a genuine smile appearing on her lips, but it vanished when Marcus looked up. "Let me see that," he said, his voice flat. I reluctantly handed him the certificate. He scanned it, his eyes stopping at the title of my essay, a muscle twitching in his jaw. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. "Literature? What are you going to do with this? Write blogs for a living?" He tossed it onto the counter like trash and looked at my mother. "Sarah, this is your fault. You keep filling her head with this useless artsy stuff." The air stood still. This was the moment for her to be my mother, to protect me. I held my breath, my eyes locked on her, pleading. She flinched as if he had struck her. She wouldn't look at me. "I'm sorry, honey," she whispered to Marcus. Then she turned to me. Her expression was a tight mask of apology. "Sarah, put it away." His words had been cruel, but hers broke me. He wasn't just insulting me. He was forcing my mother to become his accomplice. He was making her take the last piece of my father that I had left and throw it away with her own hands. That fall, I had a part-time job as a clerk at the commissary on the nearby airbase. It was my escape plan. For 20 hours a week, I could breathe, laugh with coworkers, and feel the simple dignity of earning my own money. My first paycheck was only $1.94, but holding it in my hands, I felt like a millionaire. It was the secret seed of freedom. I walked into the house that Friday, my heart soaring, but it plummeted the moment I saw him. Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. In front of him was a ledger book. "Hand it over," he commanded. My hands trembled as I gave him the check. He signed it, then pushed the ledger toward me. "Write it down. Every penny dates hours worked total." He tapped the paper. "From now on, everything belongs to me. You think the electricity, water, food you eat falls from the sky? You live under my roof. You eat my food. You need to contribute." He turned my hard-earned money, my ticket to escape, into rent for a prison cell. The final wall of that prison slammed shut on my 18th birthday. My mother, in a small act of rebellion, had spent the day making my favorite meal, a tray of rich, bubbling enchiladas. It was her way of saying, "I love you," without having to speak the words. As we sat down, Marcus slid a plain manila envelope across the table. It wasn't a birthday card. Inside was a pre-filled application for the local community college. He had already chosen my major, aircraft maintenance. "This is your future," he declared. "Time to be realistic. You'll go to school, live at home, and get a job to help this family." Tears spilled from my eyes. "I want to study to be a pilot," I choked out. "I want to go to the Air Force Academy away from here." He slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. "Don't be ungrateful," he roared, his face reddening. "Who do you think you are to make demands? Your mother doesn't even have a job." That night, long after the house had gone quiet, I heard the TV in the living room. It was Oprah's voice. I crept out and saw her on the screen. "Turn your wounds into wisdom," she said. Those words hit me with the force of a real punch. Wisdom. I slipped into my mother's room. Marcus was snoring. She was sitting by the window, a dark silhouette against the distant, twinkling lights of the city. "Mom," I whispered, my voice choking. "Why do you let him do this to us?" For the first time, she didn't offer excuses. She turned around and I could see the glint of tears on her face. Her voice was a ragged, broken whisper. "Because I'm scared, Sarah. I'm terrified of being alone. I'm terrified of not being able to provide for you, at least. At least he's here." She reached out and took my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "You're stronger than me," she said, her eyes finally meeting mine, filled with terrible, desperate clarity. "Don't let him break you like he broke me. Go, save yourself." This wasn't a mother abandoning her child. This was a prisoner begging her cellmate to find a way to escape. And in her desperate plea, she had given me the only permission I really needed. My mother's words that night, "Go save yourself," became fuel for a fire I didn't know I had. It was the permission I had been waiting 6 years to receive. The next morning, I told Marcus I was going to the library to study for finals. Instead, I took 2 buses across town to the recruitment office in Dallas, a sterile, modest building tucked into a strip mall. The room smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Posters of determined-looking pilots in pristine uniforms lined the walls, their eyes fixed on some distant horizon. The recruitment sergeant, a man named Sergeant Davis, had a face like carved granite, but kind, tired eyes. He listened patiently as I told him the sanitized version of my story, that I was looking for challenge, purpose, a way to become strong. He placed several brochures on the metal desk. Army, Navy, Air Force. Then he pushed one forward. It was for the pilot program. The cover showed pilots beside fighter jets, going through complex cockpits, their faces serious and focused. The images depicted a brutal, unforgiving world. I didn't feel afraid. I felt a deep recognition. This was a hell I could choose. "This path will try to break you, kid," Sergeant Davis said, his voice like low gravel. "I know," I replied, my voice steady, "but I'm already used to being broken." There was one major obstacle. I was still a few months shy of 18. I needed a parent's signature. That paper felt like the final insurmountable wall. I brought the recruitment packet home in my backpack, its weight feeling heavier than any textbook. That night, I waited until I heard Marcus's Mustang rumble out of the driveway. He was heading to the sports bar with friends. I found my mother in the living room, reading quietly. My hands shook as I pulled the papers from my bag and placed them on the coffee table in front of her. She picked them up, her brow furrowing in confusion. She read every word, every line, and with each page she turned, the color drained from her face. When she finished reading, she looked at me, her eyes a storm of terror and love. It was a terrible choice I was forcing her to make. My safety in the present versus my chance at a future. "They'll hurt you, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It hurts more here," I said gently, and the simple truth of those words hung in the air between us. She looked out through the window and into the dark street as if searching for an answer out there. She was silent for a minute that felt like an eternity. Then she picked up the pen from the end table. The blue ink of her signature, Sarah Rodriguez, trembled on the dotted line. It was the bravest thing I had ever seen her do. She couldn't escape the cage herself, but with one trembling stroke of the pen, she had just unlocked the door for me. I decided to tell Marcus the next evening over dinner. I needed to do it my way, facing him not as a child asking permission, but as a young woman announcing a decision. As I explained the enlistment, his face went through a series of emotions. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally a wave of pure, violent rage. He shot up from his chair, sending it crashing backward onto the tile floor. "What do you think you are? A pilot?" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "You belong to me. You live in my house. You breathe my air. You're not going anywhere." He raised his hand, a motion that had always made me instinctively cower and cringe, but not this time. I stood firm, my feet planted, my gaze unwavering. "You don't own me," I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. "And this isn't your house. It was bought and paid for with my father's life insurance money." His eyes blazed with murderous fire, but my calmness, my refusal to be intimidated, threw him off balance. For the first time, he saw not the frightened little girl he could control, but a stranger he didn't recognize. He saw a threat he knew he had lost. The day I left, the air in the house was thick and heavy as lead. While I packed a small duffel bag in my room, Marcus sat in the living room staring at the TV. His presence was like a malignant tumor, festering hatred at the center of the house. In one final petty act of cruelty, he kicked over a small box of mementos I had placed by the door. A few old photos, a small airplane model from my father. "You're taking nothing from here but your own failure," he spat. I ignored him, but I did pick up one small, faded photograph from the floor, a picture of my father, young and proud, in his Navy dress uniform. I slipped it into my pocket. The fighting spirit was in my blood. At the door, my mother pulled me into a fierce, desperate embrace. She didn't cry, but I could feel her entire body trembling against me, a silent storm of grief and fear. She pressed a crumpled envelope into my hand. Inside, I later discovered, was $200 in cash that she must have saved dollar by dollar for months. "Be strong," she whispered in my ear, her final command to me. As I walked down the driveway toward the Greyhound bus that would take me to the processing station, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I got on the bus, found a window seat, and only then did I allow myself to look. That moment on the bus was the loneliest I had ever felt in my entire life. That was the price of freedom. If you've ever had to make a painful choice to save yourself, hit that like button to show a little support. And in the comments below, just type the words, "You are not alone," so anyone else feeling that way today can see. I watched my mother's small figure shrink, still standing there at the edge of the lawn until she was just a blur against the backdrop of the house I used to call home. I was finally free, but I had never felt so alone. Pilot training at Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, was a purposely built hell on earth. From the moment we stepped off the bus, we were systematically dismantled. The drill sergeants, with voices like gravel crushers, screamed in our faces, pushing our bodies beyond every imaginable limit of physical and mental endurance. They broke us down day after day in the humid heat of Texas, in freezing mud in the dead of night. They wanted to shatter us into a million pieces, but there was a fundamental difference. Marcus broke me to destroy me. They broke me to rebuild me stronger than before, piece by piece. Every morning at 0400, when the alarm rang and my entire body screamed in protest, when every muscle felt like shattered glass, I would see Marcus's smug, hateful face in my mind, and I would get up. This pain was different. This pain was my choice. It had purpose, and most importantly, it had an end date. The hell I had left behind had none of those things. In the worst moments of exhaustion, a General Patton quote I had read once would echo in my head. "Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." This was my challenge. Victory was my way out. In the first few weeks, I felt completely alone. A Texas girl, adrift in a sea of hardened recruits from across the country. My main rival was a woman named Phoenix. She was from a military town in North Carolina, tough as a $2 steak and just as lean. She spoke in short, clipped sentences and had a stare that could cut through steel. We were competitors, constantly trying to outrun, outfly, and outlast each other. Everything changed during a navigation training exercise deep in the mountains of New Mexico. We were on a grueling 4-hour training flight, each piloting basic trainer aircraft. About 2 hours into the flight, my aircraft's engine malfunctioned, and I felt a horrific explosion. Alarms, blazing red and blinding, shot up in the cockpit. I was losing altitude, feeling control of the aircraft slipping from my hands. This is it, I thought. I'm done. I expected Phoenix, who was flying right next to me, to just continue the mission. That's what we were trained to do. Focus on the task, complete the objective. But she didn't. Over the radio, I heard her voice, calm and certain. "Tower, this is Phoenix 2. Rodriguez has engine failure. I'm going to escort her back to base." She flew alongside me for 50 miles back to base, guiding me through every step of the emergency landing, her voice the only anchor in the storm of my panic. That night, huddled in our small dorm room, our uniforms soaked with stress sweat, we shared a pack of crackers from the vending machine. She never mentioned the incident or her sacrifice. We just sat in comfortable silence, looking out the window. For the first time in 6 years, the crushing weight of loneliness was lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was part of a team. I had an ally. Our commanding officer was Captain Linda Harrison, a woman with sharp gray eyes and an unbreakable reputation. She rarely smiled and never praised. Her approval was a currency more valuable than gold, and none of us felt we had earned it. At the end of the training cycle, in the final one-on-one evaluations, I sat across from her in her austere office, my back straight as a rod. She stared at my file for a long moment, then looked directly at me, her gaze so intense it felt like she was x-raying my soul. "Rodriguez," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Your file says you came here running from something. Many people do. They usually don't survive." She leaned forward slightly. "But what I see isn't a runner. I see a fighter. You don't just survive, Rodriguez. You adapt, you overcome, and you refuse to quit." She closed my file with a soft thud. "Welcome to the team." Her words hit me harder than any physical blow ever had. This wasn't praise. This was recognition. This was a declaration of my worth earned through grit and sweat and pain. This was the validation I had craved my entire life, not from the family that should have given it freely, but from a woman who had seen the warrior I had been forged into. It was worth more than any medal. After graduation, I was assigned to a base on the West Coast, close enough to feel the Pacific breeze again, but a whole world away from the life I had left behind. I was given a small one-bedroom apartment in the base housing complex. It was beige and bland with government-issued furniture, but it was all mine. The first time I went grocery shopping, I just stood in the cereal aisle, overwhelmed. I could buy anything I wanted. I could eat whenever I was hungry. No one was monitoring my choices. No one demanding receipts, no one judging me. It was a simple, profound freedom. That night I worked up the courage to call home. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice a hoarse, worried whisper. In the background, I could hear the tinny sound of a sports program on TV, Marcus's show. "Mom, it's me. I'm okay," I said, trying to pump a brightness into my voice that I didn't really feel. "I graduated. I have my own place now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought she might have hung up. I could hear her light, shallow breathing. Then her voice, thick with unshed tears, came through the phone. "I'm so happy, sweetheart," she whispered before quickly adding, "I have to go." The line went dead. I stood there in my empty, quiet apartment, the silence ringing in my ears. I knew she was proud. I knew she was relieved. But she couldn't say it. She was still a prisoner, and her warden was in the next room. For a while, my new life fell into a rhythm that felt blissfully normal. There was the satisfying exhaustion of flight training, the intense focus of work, and the easy camaraderie of weekend beers with Phoenix and the rest of the unit. I was building a life brick by brick, a fortress of discipline and purpose. But the calls home were a constant, uneasy echo from the world I had escaped. They were never long. My mother always spoke in short, clipped sentences, her voice tight with anxiety transmitted through the phone line. Whenever I asked if she was okay, the answer was always the same memorized line, "I'm fine, sweetheart." Then she would quickly change the subject. But I could always hear him in the background, a ghost at the feast, a casual comment controlling like, "Who is that?" Or an impatient, "Hang up the phone, it costs money." He was still there, an invisible warden monitoring her every word. Each time I hung up, a cold knot of guilt would tighten in my stomach. I was free, but I had left my first soldier behind enemy lines. One week, I called and told her about a training flight Phoenix and I had taken up into the mountains. I described the crisp air, the mountain scenery, the feeling of accomplishment. I wanted to send her a piece of my freedom. She listened, her responses vague and distracted. Then she said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. "That's nice, honey," she mumbled. "Here, Marcus just finished the new security system. It's very thorough." The way she said it, not with pride but with flat, hollow resignation, told me everything. He wasn't just improving the property. He was reinforcing the walls of her prison. That Christmas, a card arrived in familiar, trembling handwriting. Inside was a photo of my mother standing in front of a sparsely decorated Christmas tree. She was smiling, but it was a brittle, paper-thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. They looked tired, haunted. And then I saw it. Right there at her temple, almost hidden by her hairline, was a faint yellow-purple bruise clumsily concealed with a thick layer of foundation. The air rushed out of my lungs. My heart pounded against my ribs with a cold, nauseating fear. The psychological warfare had escalated to a physical front. He was no longer content with just breaking her spirit. Now he was breaking her body. I called her immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The bruise on your face," I said, my voice low and tight, "in the Christmas photo." There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, shallow and fast. Then her voice, small and weak, came back. "Oh, that! I just fell down the stairs, honey. You know how clumsy I am." The lie was worse than the truth. It was so obvious, so pathetic. It told me that she wasn't just a victim, but was now actively protecting her abuser. The invisible walls around her were no longer just his creation. Now she was helping maintain them. "I'm coming home," I said, the decision forming and solidifying in an instant. The immediate, instinctive response. "No, don't, Sarah, please," she begged, her voice rising in pure panic. "You can't. It will only make things worse. Marcus, he won't like it." Then I heard his voice, a low growl from somewhere behind her. He must have snatched the phone from her hands. "What's it going to do?" He rumbled into the receiver, his voice dripping with contempt. "Call the police. Who's going to believe a kid who abandoned her family to join the military?" The line went dead. I sat there in my sterile, quiet apartment, the dead phone still pressed to my ear. The freedom I had fought so hard for, the strength I had built, the new life I had created. It all felt like a bitter illusion. I was a pilot in the United States Air Force, capable of handling threats most people couldn't imagine. But I was completely powerless to save my own mother. I was free, but she wasn't. And he was using her to mock me, to remind me that no matter how far I flew, his shadow could still reach me. That night, Phoenix found me in the base gym, punishing a heavy bag with near-maniacal ferocity. Sweat and tears streamed down my face as I told her everything, the calls, the photo, the threats. She just listened, her expression unreadable, letting me exhaust my rage and grief. When I finally collapsed against the bag, my knuckles raw and my lungs burning, she placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, Rodriguez," she said, her voice straightforward and without pity. "But you can absolutely show them there's a life raft waiting." She paused, her grip tightening slightly. "And you're not that 18-year-old kid anymore. You're a pilot. You're trained to fly into hostile situations and neutralize threats. Think of this as another mission, a personal one." Her words cut through my despair like a laser. She was right. I had been thinking like a daughter, like a victim. It was time to start thinking like a pilot. I wasn't going back there to beg or reason. I was going back to extract a friendly trapped in hostile territory. That night, I sat down at my government-issued laptop, the screen light illuminating my determined face. I opened the web browser and with 3 decisive clicks, I booked a one-way ticket to Dallas International Airport. Mission approved. When the taxi pulled up to the curb, I felt a knot in my stomach. It was the same house, the same faded blue trim, the same overgrown bougainvillea I remembered, but it felt alien, shrouded in darkness that had nothing to do with the overcast sky. I paid the driver and walked up the familiar concrete path, my duffel bag feeling impossibly heavy. On the flight, I had mentally prepared myself for this, repeating a Bible verse my grandmother used to read to me, a line that felt more like a battle chant than a prayer. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She was much thinner than I remembered, her bones sharp beneath a thin sweater. Dark, hollow circles surrounded her eyes. She pulled me into an embrace, but it was a quick, bird-like hug, brittle and full of fear. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her eyes darting anxiously toward the inside of the house. And then he was there, filling the space behind her. Marcus emerged from the living room, wiping greasy hands on dirty jeans. He looked me up and down, a slow, deliberate assessment, and a calculating smile slid across his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, his voice oozing false friendliness. "Look like a real pilot, but inside still just a scared little girl." My eyes swept across the living room wall behind him. A cold rage settled in my chest. Every photograph of my father laughing at their wedding, holding me as a baby, standing proudly beside his first car was gone. Instead hung a grotesque gallery of Marcus's triumphs, posed photos of him grinning beside cars and machinery, his empty eyes staring blankly from the wall. He hadn't just moved in. He had systematically erased my father, rewriting our family history in grease and metal. For the next 24 hours, I tried to speak privately with my mother, but he was a constant, suffocating presence. He never left us alone for a moment, hovering nearby, pretending to fix an old computer or watch the game on TV, but I knew he was listening to every word. I waited for a moment when he went out to the garage, and I quickly pressed a small folded business card into my mother's hand. It was for the National Domestic Violence Hotline and a network of safe houses. "Mom, these people can help," I whispered urgently. "They have safe houses, lawyers, everything you need to get out." She stared at the card in her palm as if I had handed her a live scorpion. Her eyes widened with terror, and she quickly stuffed it into her pocket when Marcus's footsteps echoed on the back porch. "I don't need that," she lied, her voice a panicked, trembling whisper. "Everything's fine, Sarah, everything's fine." The painful truth fell like a punch to the stomach. The prison walls weren't just on the outside anymore. He had built them inside her mind, and she had become her own jailer. Dinner that evening was torture. Marcus held court at the head of the table, boasting about his latest construction jobs, about how hard he worked, about how well he took care of my mother. He was playing the benevolent patriarch, a role so grotesquely false it made me physically sick. I listened, my fork frozen on my plate, calm maintained by years of military discipline. But when he placed his hand on my mother's and said, "She's a lucky woman," I finally broke. "What about the bruise on Mom's face in the Christmas photo?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, cutting through his monologue like a razor. "Is that part of the care too?" The room fell into dead, echoing silence. My mother's fork clattered to her plate. She froze, breath caught in her throat. Marcus slowly set down his fork. The charming smile vanished from his face, peeling away to reveal the snarling monster beneath. "You better watch that mouth of yours," he hissed, leaning across the table. "You weren't here. You don't know what's right and wrong anymore. You abandoned her. I'm the one who stayed." The next morning, as I was about to leave for the airport, he cornered me in the entryway. My mother had retreated to the back of the house, a silent surrender. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his voice low and deep with threat, blocking my path to the door. "Think you can fly in here, stir up trouble, and fly right back out?" He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "The world's small little pilot. You can fly, but you can't hide. I know where you are. I know where you work. And if I can't have your mother peaceful and quiet, then you'll never have a moment's peace for the rest of your life. This wasn't a threat made in anger. This was a vow. This was a promise of future violence delivered with the cold certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable. If you've ever had that chilling moment when looking at someone you're supposed to trust and seeing a monster looking back, hit that like button. And in the comments, just type one word. I see you. Let's show each other we're not alone in this. As I sat on the plane, flying high above the sprawling lights of Dallas, I didn't feel relief. I felt the cold fear of a pilot who had just flown through a danger zone and heard the first warning beeps behind me. I hadn't resolved a problem. I had just pulled the pin on a grenade, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. Returning to the structured world of the base felt like surfacing for air, but I couldn't escape the chill of Marcus's final promise. His threat wasn't a memory. It was a ghost that followed me back, haunting the edges of my newfound peace. I tried to bury myself in familiar routines, early morning flights, aircraft maintenance, tactical briefings, but the armor I had built for myself felt thin and brittle. I became hypervigilant. Every white Mustang that passed on the road made my heart jump to my throat. Every strange noise outside the apartment at night woke me instantly, body rigid, listening in the darkness. I started checking door locks 3 times before bed, a compulsive ritual to ward off nameless fear. Phoenix noticed the change. We were at the shooting range one afternoon when my hands trembled slightly while loading ammunition. "He's in your head, Rodriguez," she said, her voice low and direct, not taking her eyes off her target. "That's his battlefield. Don't let him win there." I tried to follow her advice. I focused on training, on missions, on the solid, predictable reality of military life. I looked at the uniform hanging in my closet, the sharp lines, the pressed fabric, the pilot stripes on the sleeves. That was my symbol now, not the helpless girl I used to be. But fear programmed into me as a child was a difficult monster to cage. 2 weeks after I returned, the first tremor hit. My phone rang late one night. It was my mother. Her voice was a panicked, broken whisper, words tumbling over each other in panic. "Marcus, he's gone. He left hours ago," he said. He said he had business to take care of. "Sarah, he took the hunting rifle." The line went dead. I called back immediately, again and again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Cold sweat broke out on my skin. I went straight to Captain Harrison and reported the call as a potential threat. She took it seriously, her face grave, but without a direct, clear threat against me. There was nothing the military police could officially do. "Stay alert, Lieutenant," was all she could say, her eyes conveying warnings that words couldn't. "Always keep your head on a swivel." That night, my personal phone rang. The screen showed blocked number. My blood froze. I hesitated, then answered, my voice a tense whisper. "Hello." Silence, complete dead silence on the other end, but it wasn't empty. Through the static, I could hear faintly a small, distant radio playing a familiar country song. It was Garth Brooks' Friends in Low Places. Marcus's favorite karaoke song, the one he drunkenly belted out at every backyard BBQ. A wave of nausea rolled through me. He wasn't just coming, he was announcing it. He was enjoying this. The psychological terror continued. A slow, methodical assault. A few mornings later, I found a cigarette butt on the concrete patio right below my bedroom window. It was a Marlboro Red, stamped out under a heel. His brand. Another day, an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. No subject, no text, just a single attachment. My hands shook as I opened it. It was an image of the old air base where I used to work part-time, the one in the backyard of my childhood home. Scrawled across it in what looked like red spray paint was a crude X. He was here, not in Texas, but here close, watching me, playing his sick, twisted cat-and-mouse game. The safe walls of the military base suddenly felt like paper. I felt 14 again, trapped in a house with no escape, the monster just down the hall. I reported everything, the calls, the cigarette butt, the email, but he was too smart. No direct evidence, no clear trail for the MPs to follow. It was just a series of unsettling coincidences, plausibly deniable. He was winning the battle in my head, just as Phoenix had warned. That night, a storm rolled in, the kind that felt like the sky was trying to break itself. Rain lashed my windows in violent sheets. Wind howled through the pine trees outside. I was sitting on the couch, a book open on my lap, but I hadn't turned a page in an hour. My eyes were glued to the front door, to the deadbolt I had checked 3, 4, 5 times. Around 10:00, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was soft, almost polite. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending screamed. "Who is it?" I called, my voice sounding thin and trembling even to my own ears. No answer, just the roar of wind and the drumming of rain. My heart was a panicked bird beating against my ribs. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing, just the wet, empty walkway lit by the flickering porch light. Just the wind, I told myself, a branch hitting the door. I took a deep, shaky breath and turned away from the door. My body was weak with the strange mixture of relief and adrenaline, and in that exact moment the world exploded. A deafening crack of splintering wood and metal echoed through the small apartment. The entire door blew inward, torn from its hinges as if kicked by a mule. And there he stood, framed in the doorway, soaked and wild, the raging storm behind him. His eyes were bloodshot, burning with pure, uncut madness. "I told you," he roared over the thunder, a terrifying grin spreading across his face. "You can't hide." In a single frozen nanosecond, the 12-year-old girl who had watched her mother collapse in grief screamed in terror. But then, a decade of brutal, relentless training slammed the door on that girl and took command. Fear was instantly vaporized by a tsunami of pure adrenaline. Conscious thought stopped. The body, honed by thousands of hours of repetition, simply reacted. As Marcus charged forward, a wild beast roaring into the sanctuary of my home, I didn't back away. My feet automatically set into fighting stance. I pivoted on my left foot, letting his own forward momentum become my strongest weapon. I lowered my center of gravity, drove my hip under his hip, and executed a hip throw I had practiced until it was as natural as breathing. He was a wall of furious muscle, but physics is a stubborn equalizer. He went tumbling over the cheap particle board coffee table I had assembled a month earlier. It exploded into a rain of compressed sawdust and shattered laminate, the sound like gunfire in the small room. But this wasn't a controlled training environment with mats and referees. This was a cramped apartment full of furniture, and my opponent was a man driven by a decade of festering hatred. He rose from the wreckage with a deep growl, a jagged piece of the broken table protruding from his forearm. He barely seemed to notice. He charged again, not like a man, but like a bull, head down, all brute force, intent on goring me. My small living room became a cage, and the fight descended from disciplined technique into a primal, desperate struggle for survival. We crashed into the wall, the impact shaking a framed photo of my training graduation to the floor. Glass shattered. I drove my knee hard into his side, aiming for the femoral nerve, a strike designed to deaden a leg. He groaned in pain, but his grip on my fatigues only tightened. He used sheer mass to lift and hurl me across the room. I landed hard against the base of the couch. Air was knocked from my lungs in a painful gasp. He was on me in an instant, his weight crushing. I tasted blood in my mouth. His fists were like bricks, raining clumsy but powerful blows. I raised my arms to cover my face, the impacts rattling my teeth, my skull shaking with each connection. I tried to put him in an arm lock, a triangle choke, anything to neutralize his strength, but he was too strong, rage giving him terrifying, inhuman power. He threw a clean punch to the side of my head, and the world flashed white with pain. Another blow caught my shoulder at a bad angle, and I felt a sickening pop as it dislocated, my left arm numb and useless beneath me. My vision began to blur, the edges going gray. And then, through the fog of pain and disorientation, I saw her. Over Marcus's heavy, sweating shoulder, framed in the destroyed doorway against the raging storm, was a dark silhouette. My mother. He must have forced her to drive 2,000 miles with him, a terrified hostage in his revenge mission. She just stood there, her face an empty, emotionless mask, her eyes vacant and dead as a porcelain doll's. She didn't scream for help. She didn't move to intervene. She didn't do anything. She just watched as her daughter was beaten to death on the apartment floor. That sight, her hollow stillness, hurt more than any punch of his. It was the final, ultimate betrayal, a wound deeper than any fist could cause. "You're just like your dad," Marcus roared, his voice, his face a twisted mask of rage. "Stubborn and useless." His words, meant to be the final nail in my coffin, instead struck a spark. They ignited the last ember of defiance in my soul. I wasn't just fighting for my own life anymore. I was fighting for my father, for his memory, for the honor this man had spent years trying to erase. With one final surge of desperate strength, I twisted and writhed, but uselessly. My body was failing. He was too heavy, too anchored. He grabbed a thick handful of my hair and brutally slammed my head against the hardwood floor. Stars exploded behind my eyes. The world tilted sideways. He shifted his weight, pinning my arms with his knees, and then those large, calloused hands, the same hands that had once pretended to fix our house, closed around my throat. "You took everything from me," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath a hot, fetid wave of whiskey and rage. The pressure increased, an iron band crushing. My airway slammed shut. My lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. Black spots danced in my vision, growing larger, merging, consuming the world. I felt myself sinking, drowning in a cold, dark, silent ocean. This was it. This was the end. He had won. He was finally snuffing me out like he had snuffed out my mother's spirit all those years ago. My body began to go limp. My final fight was draining away. But then a single thought pierced the suffocating darkness. A voice, not his, not mine, it was Phoenix's. "We don't leave anyone behind." My team, my real family. Harrison's face, stern and proud. Phoenix's, loyal and fierce. The faces of those who had become my brothers. They were my reason. They were the anchor in the storm. With a final spasm of pure will, my only good arm, my right arm, flailed weakly across the floor beside me. My fingers touched something cool, smooth, and hard. My phone. It must have been knocked from my pocket. My vision was almost gone. A tiny pinprick of light in a black universe. I couldn't see the screen. I couldn't think. Only muscle memory drilled into me from years of operating equipment in darkness. The instinctive swipe up to unlock. The familiar tap where the messaging app icon should be. A touch at the top of the screen where Phoenix's name was always in recent contacts. My thumb, clumsy and numb, hovered over the keyboard. 3 letters, 3 desperate, panicked pulses of my thumb against the cold glass. SOS. My hand fell away limp. The final pinprick of light vanished. Cold, dark water closed over my head, and I knew nothing more. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Seconds, minutes. It felt like an eternity in that dark, silent abyss. The first thing that pierced the darkness wasn't Marcus's voice, but a chaotic sound. There was shouting, loud and angry, authoritative voices giving orders. The rhythmic, heavy thudding of combat boots rushing across my floor, and underneath it all, the rising and falling wail of sirens drawing closer and closer. When my eyes opened, the first thing I saw wasn't my apartment ceiling, but Phoenix's panicked, horrified face bent over me. Her eyes, usually austere and unreadable, were wide with terror that mirrored my own. Behind her, my destroyed apartment was a whirlwind of movement. I saw two massive military police officers dragging a screaming, struggling Marcus to his feet. They slammed him against the wall, twisted his arms behind his back, the sharp click of handcuffs echoing through the room. He was no longer a terrifying monster, just a pathetic middle-aged man, flailing and spitting meaningless curses. He was just a bully who had finally met a bigger force. I later learned that when Phoenix received my text, those 3 clear letters, sauce, she didn't call 911. She didn't call the base MPs. She did something far more effective. She activated the informal network, the phone tree that every tight unit has for emergencies. She called our entire squad. The first to arrive were 2 from our unit who lived in the same housing complex. They were the ones who kicked in the already broken door and pulled Marcus off me. The next thing I knew, I was in the sterile white world of the base hospital. The sharp, clean smell of antiseptic replaced the stench of fear and whiskey. My shoulder had been reset, a dull, throbbing pain radiating through my arm. My face was swollen, a tender mess. When I finally came fully awake, the first person I saw was Phoenix. She was asleep in a hard, plastic visitor's chair pulled right up to the bed. Her head was bowed to her chest, still in mud-stained flight gear from a training exercise. She hadn't left my side. On the small bedside table, next to a plastic water cup, was a pink and white cardboard box. Inside was half a dozen mixed donuts from the 24-hour shop just outside the main gate, the ones I loved. That small, simple gesture of care, of knowing, of being there, was a kindness so profound it brought hot tears to my eyes. A few hours later, I had more visitors. Captain Harrison and the base commander, a colonel named Morrison, entered my room. Colonel Morrison was an imposing man with a chest full of ribbons and a commanding voice that demanded attention without ever having to raise it. He stood by my bed, hands clasped behind his back, his expression grave and resolute. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I've been fully briefed. Let me be absolutely clear. An attack on one of my pilots in their home, on my base, is an attack on the United States Air Force itself." He looked from me to Captain Harrison, then back. "We will not let this stand. This man has made the single biggest mistake of his life." And in that moment, I understood. Marcus had made a fatal miscalculation. In his arrogant, hate-filled mind, he had driven 2,000 miles to attack a frightened, vulnerable girl he had terrorized for a decade. He never imagined he was actually attacking a lieutenant in the Air Force, a valued member of one of the most fiercely loyal and deadly families on the planet. He hadn't just poked a bear. He had kicked a hive the size of a city block. And now the entire swarm was descending. They told me what had happened to my mother. The MPs had found her in the passenger seat of Marcus's Mustang in the parking lot. She was catatonic, curled into a small ball, trembling uncontrollably and unable to speak, a complete mental breakdown. The paramedics had taken her to the psychiatric ward of the same hospital. Later that day, a nurse wheeled me down the hallway. I saw her through a small reinforced glass window in the door. She looked tiny, fragile, completely broken. All the anger I had felt toward her for her weakness, for her silence, for standing by and watching, all of it just evaporated, replaced by a wave of infinite, heartbreaking pity. She was also a victim of this war, a prisoner of war who had been on the battlefield far longer than I had. Marcus hadn't just tried to kill me that night. He had succeeded in destroying what was left of her. A few days later, when the swelling on my face had gone down and I could sit up without getting dizzy, a woman in sharp dress uniform entered my room. She She had keen, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, I'm Captain Chen," she said, her handshake firm and confident. "I'm with JAG Corps. Colonel Morrison has personally assigned me to your case." She sat down in the chair Phoenix had vacated. "We're going to prosecute Marcus Thompson to the full extent of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and Civilian Law. He attacked a service member on a federal installation. The charges will be extensive." She placed a small digital recorder on the bedside table. "But to build the strongest possible case, I need you to tell me everything. Start from the very beginning. Don't leave out a single detail." I took a deep, shaky breath and looked at the small black device. For the first time, I wasn't telling my story as a victim whispering in the darkness. I was telling it as a witness, as a pilot, as a survivor. And I knew the final battle was just beginning. The court-martial wasn't like I had imagined. No dramatic shouting, no last-minute confessions. Just the cold, methodical presentation of truth. With Captain Chen beside me, a formidable and brilliant legal warrior, I took the stand in full dress uniform. I looked out at the courtroom, at the stone-faced jury of officers, at Marcus sitting beside his defense attorney, trying to look like a misunderstood victim. And I told my story. I recounted a decade of hell, not with tears or anger, but with the calm, factual precision of a pilot giving a post-mission report. I detailed the psychological abuse, the financial control, the escalating threats, and the final violent attack. My testimony was supported by a mountain of evidence the JAG Corps had meticulously compiled. Financial records, witness statements from co-workers at the commissary, threatening emails, and forensic evidence from my apartment. The most powerful moment came during cross-examination. Marcus's lawyer tried to paint me as a troubled, rebellious teenager, an ungrateful runaway daughter who had fled a loving home. "Isn't it true, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt, "that you have a history of defying Mr. Thompson's authority?" Before I could answer, a quiet sound came from the gallery. I glanced over. In the front row, Phoenix, Captain Harrison, Colonel Morrison, and a dozen other pilots from my unit, my family, all stood up in silent, unified protest. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, an imposing wall of decorated uniforms, their collective gaze fixed on the defense attorney. It was a silent, powerful rebuke, a show of support that spoke louder than any objection. The lawyer faltered, stammered, and quickly ended his cross-examination. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, his lies crumbled under Captain Chen's relentless questioning. He was no longer the monster, just a small, pathetic man whose carefully constructed facade had been torn away. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict came back guilty on all charges: attempted murder, aggravated assault, federal stalking. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Justice wasn't a fiery act of revenge. It was the cold, quiet click of a prison door locking shut. A few months later, my mother was released from the treatment facility. She was fragile but clear-eyed. The fog of fear was finally beginning to lift. We agreed to meet at a small, quiet park overlooking the ocean in Malibu, a place my father had loved. We sat on a bench watching the waves crash against the rocks below, the cool salt air on our faces. For a long time, we just sat in silence. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was afraid for too long. I was too scared to be the mother you needed." Tears I didn't know I still had stung my eyes. I reached out and took her hand. It was thin, but the grip was firm. "I know, Mom," I said, "and I'm sorry I had to leave you." We didn't need to say anything else. In that shared silence, with the sound of the ocean as witness, we began to slowly, carefully rebuild the bridge that had been destroyed so long ago. The wounds Marcus had inflicted left scars. But as Oprah once said, you can turn your wounds into wisdom. My pain gave me a new purpose. With the full support of Colonel Morrison and the Air Force, I started a pilot program called Operation Safe Skies. It was a confidential hotline and support network for military members and their families who were silently fighting domestic violence. The military trains us to fight enemies abroad, but sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one sleeping in the bed next to you. I used my story, the signs I had missed, the patterns of control, the escalation, to train commanding officers and senior NCOs on how to recognize the subtle red flags of abuse, how to intervene safely, how to help a pilot and their family get the help they needed before it was too late. The wound Marcus meant to be a sign of his power. Instead, I turned that scar into a shield for others. My story, the story you've listened to, is over. But my journey isn't. Today I still serve, but my battlefield has expanded. Sometimes on weekends, my mother and I will drive out to Santa Monica Beach. She'll bring a book like she used to. I don't surf anymore, but I sit with her on the sand, feeling the warmth of the California sun on my face. Marcus tried to drown me in his darkness, but he failed. He didn't understand that sometimes it's from the deepest, darkest places that you find the strength to create your own dawn. My legacy won't be the story of how I survived his attack. My legacy will be the people I help find their own dawn. Thank you for listening to my story. The truth is there are millions of survivors out there who have walked through fire and are still healing from the scars. If my journey has resonated with you, you are not alone. This channel is a place for our stories to be heard and our strength to be shared. Please subscribe and join our community, because every time one of us stands up and speaks our truth, we light the path for someone else still lost in the darkness. Be the light. I'll see you in the comments.